The city of Chicago does not quiet itself for winter. It leans into the cold, steel and glass holding their shapes against the wind, while the streets below fill with the sound of tires compressing fresh snow. On the night of January 14th, the temperature had dropped to 11 degrees, and the sidewalks outside Northbridge Capitol were empty, except for the maintenance truck sitting in the loading bay with its engine idling, exhaust rising in pale columns into the dark. Daniel Hayes parked the supply cart against the service elevator wall and pressed the button for the 42nd floor. He was 32 years old and had been working this job for 14 months. He knew which offices cluttered on Thursdays, which hallways smelled of carpet cleaner by Friday morning, and which janitor on the day shift cut corners near the executive bathrooms and thought no one noticed. He knew the building the way a person knows anything they move through every night without being seen, not fondly, not bitterly, but completely. His son Lucas was in room 407 at St. Michael's Medical Center, 4 miles north. The boy was 7 years old and had a congenital heart defect that the cardiologist, Dr. Elaine Forsyth, had described using language Daniel had looked up on his phone afterward, sitting in his car in the hospital parking garage with the heat running. What he had understood clearly was this: the surgery needed to happen within 48 hours. The cost, not covered by his insurance, was $114,000. The elevator rose. The city spread out below through the service window, amber, white, the irregular grid of streets receding, until they looked like the circuitry of something enormous and indifferent. Daniel watched it for the 6 floors that the window faced south before the shaft wall blocked the view. Then he watched the floor numbers change. He thought about nothing in particular. He had trained himself, over the past several months, to stop thinking during the hours he could not solve anything. The skill had taken longer to develop than he expected. He was not naturally a person who could silence the operational part of his mind, the part that ran projections and stress-tested assumptions. But necessity was a good teacher. He had learned. He began at the far end of the 42nd floor, working inward from the northwest corner. Northbridge Capitol occupied the entire floor, roughly 18,000 square feet of open workstations, glass-walled conference rooms, a kitchen, and 2 washrooms, and, at the southeast corner, a suite of executive offices behind frosted glass panels. At midnight, it was the kind of quiet that felt architectural. Built into the walls. Load-bearing. The overhead lights had shifted to their automated night setting, a cooler and dimmer register that turned the partition glass into mirrors. Daniel moved through the reflected version of himself without paying it much attention. He had done this long enough that his own reflection in darkened glass barely registered. He emptied the bins beside the analyst workstations, 14 of them arranged in 2 rows, wiped down the kitchen counter and the front of the refrigerator, which was always fingerprinted regardless of the day or season, replaced the paper towels in the executive washroom, restocked the soap dispenser, and ran a damp cloth along the edge of the basin. These were the tasks. He did them. He had not always done this work. From 24 to 29, Daniel had been a quantitative analyst at Merritt & Caulfield, a mid-sized investment firm headquartered 2 blocks north of where he was currently mopping a floor. He had been good at it, detail-oriented, precise about data structures, able to hold complex models in his working memory while checking for failures at the margins. His supervisor at the time, a meticulous man named Howard Kessler, had told him during a year-end review that he had a gift for seeing what was wrong. Daniel had not fully understood this as a compliment until later. He had left the firm under circumstances he did not discuss. The leaving had cost him the career, a professional network he had spent 5 years building, and a version of himself that had believed those things constituted a foundation rather than an arrangement. He had spent 8 months afterward not working, and not particularly looking for work, which was not laziness. Daniel was constitutionally incapable of laziness, but a kind of suspension, a period of recalibration that he had not been able to name while it was happening. Then Lucas was diagnosed, and Daniel needed insurance, and a cleaning company was hiring. And the question of what he was becoming took a step back behind the more immediate question of what his son needed. He pushed the cart past the executive conference room, a long table of dark wood, 12 chairs, a whiteboard still bearing the remnants of a framework, drawing from the previous week, The kind of thing that looks important during a meeting and illegible 48 hours later, and turned toward the CEO's office at the corner. The door was closed, which was normal. The light under it was off, which was also normal at this hour. He wiped the glass panel beside the door, with the methodical ease of someone who has wiped it 200 times, restocked the small supply cabinet built into the corridor alcove, and then moved around the corner toward the external window alcove, where the recycling and waste bins were kept. That was where he found it. A black duffel bag, military-style webbing on the handles, zipped fully closed. Positioned beside the blue recycling bin in a way that suggested deliberate placement rather than accident. It was not unusual to find personal items near the service areas people discarded or forgot things at the office with a carelessness they would not apply at home. Over 14 months, Daniel had found a cashmere overcoat left on top of a waste bin, a pair of still new running shoes, a leather portfolio with someone's initials embossed on the cover. He had logged all of them with building security. He picked up the bag to move it. The weight stopped him. He stood in the alcove for a moment. The city was behind him through the glass. 11 floors of other buildings visible in the mid-distance. Lights in irregular patterns marking the offices where other people were working late or had left without turning things off. The bag was in both his hands. He did not move. Then he crouched, set it on the floor, and unzipped it. He made no sound. There was nothing to say. The money was banded in standard increments and stacked with a consistency that suggested professional handling rather than personal accumulation. He did not count it, but his former professional instincts read the visible stacks and arrived at a number. He zipped the bag closed. He stood. He stayed where he was for a while longer. The bag at his feet. The city behind the glass exactly as it had been. The elevator at the far end of the corridor opened and closed on some automated delivery cycle. The refrigeration unit in the kitchen cycled on and produced a low mechanical hum. Daniel picked up the bag and placed it in the bottom of the supply cart, beneath the folded drop cloth he used for floor buffing. He finished the rest of his rounds on the 42nd floor, the 2 remaining conference rooms, the secondary washroom, the analyst kitchen adjacent to the trading support section. He worked at his normal pace. He did not rush. He did not linger. In the service elevator on the way down, he stood with his hands on the cart's handle and his eyes on the floor indicator. He thought about nothing in particular. He was back to that. His apartment was on the 3rd floor of a building in Pilsen. The radiators knocked when the heat kicked on a metallic complaint that had woken him up twice in the first month before he stopped hearing it. One of the living room windows had a crack in the lower pane, sealed with weather tape he kept meaning to replace with something more permanent. He had hung Lucas's drawings on the wall beside the television. Rockets drawn in red crayon, a complicated-looking dog, a horse that was functionally a rectangle with 4 legs and a triangular ear, which Lucas had defended with specificity when Daniel suggested it might not look entirely like a horse. He set the bag on the kitchen table and sat across from it. The apartment had the cold of old buildings in winter, not extreme but persistent, lodged in the baseboards and the corners of rooms. He could hear Lucas breathing through the monitor on the kitchen counter, the one he kept on even though Lucas was 7 and had asked twice if they could retire it. Daniel kept it on. He had become, over the past 8 months, a man who needed to hear his son breathing in the dark. He unzipped the bag and looked at the money without touching it. His former training was clinical about this. Read the stack dimensions, read the banding labels, read what the arrangement told you about the source. He put the figure at approximately $2 million. He sat with this number and did not feel anything dramatic. The money was information. He was processing information, $114,000. He had written the number on a legal pad the evening after Dr. Forsyth's conversation and then disposed of the pad because he did not need to write it down. He would not forget it. He had not forgotten a number with that kind of weight attached to it since the day he first learned to read a balance sheet. He thought about what taking the money would mean in practical terms. Lucas would have the surgery. Lucas would, in Dr. Forsyth's assessment, very likely recover without permanent deficit. The boy would come home. He would eat cereal and draw more rectangles with legs and grow up. These were not small things. These were, measured by the only metric Daniel currently found reliable, the most significant things. He thought about what the bag meant in the context of the floor where he had found it. A CEO's floor. A service alcove. $2 million in organized cash, military-grade bag. Placed beside a recycling bin with the deliberateness of someone who knew exactly where building cameras did and did not reach. In his former professional life, he had learned enough about the way money moved through institutional structures and around institutional structures to recognize the specific shape of what he was looking at. This was not an accidental loss. This was not a forgotten gym bag. This was something that belonged to a situation that was ongoing, a situation that, if he removed $2 million from it, would redistribute its weight in ways he could not fully model with the information available to him. He thought about his son sleeping in the room 10 feet away. He thought about a specific afternoon 5 years ago, sitting at a workstation at Merritt and Caulfield, looking at a spreadsheet that contained numbers arranged in a pattern he recognized as intentional and wrong. He had looked at that spreadsheet for 3 days before making a phone call. He did not think of the phone call as courage. At the time or subsequently, he thought of it as the only move available to someone who was unwilling to look at that spreadsheet for a 4th day. He was not certain the situations were analogous. He ran the comparison anyway, the way he would run any analysis, systematically, without attachment to a preferred outcome. By 3 in the morning, he had arrived at a place that was less a decision and more a recognition. The money was not his. Taking it would cost him something he did not have a word for yet but could feel clearly, a structural thing, the kind of cost that compounds over time in ways that are invisible until they are not. He was already a man who had lost certain things. He was not willing to lose this. He rezipped the bag. He went to lie down on the couch, because he had left the bag on the kitchen table and did not want to look at it from the bedroom doorway, and he needed to sleep before the morning. He left the apartment at 5:40. The sky outside was still fully dark. The streetlights haloed in the cold. He had checked on Lucas before leaving. The boy was asleep on his side, with the yellow blanket pulled up to his chin, and left a note on the kitchen counter for Mrs. Delgado from the 2nd floor, who had agreed to come up at 7. He paid her in cash, $40 for each morning, which she accepted without discussion, and which he knew she needed more than she indicated. He took the bus with the bag between his feet. The route ran south then east before turning north toward the river, and at 5:40 in January it carried the people who started before the city officially started, the hospital workers, the restaurant prep cooks, the building staff, the overnight shift finishers heading home with their coats buttoned to the throat, and their expressions calibrated to the medium distance. No one looked at Daniel. No one looked at the bag. The bus moved through the streets with the particular unhurried efficiency of transit in the early morning, stopping where it was supposed to stop and moving on, indifferent to anything its passengers were carrying. He thought about Lucas's appointment that afternoon, the pre-op blood work Dr. Forsyth had scheduled. He thought about the tone of the cardiologist's voice when she had reviewed the latest imaging, not alarmed, but focused in a way that communicated the seriousness of the timeline. 48 hours was not a figure of speech. It was a number with a medical basis. He got off at the Northbridge stop. The lobby security desk was staffed by Gerald Mack, who had worked the overnight rotation at the building for 11 years, and who knew Daniel by face and approximate function without knowing his name, which suited both of them. Daniel set the bag on the security counter. He had written the note at home, 4 words on a piece of paper torn from a notepad. Found in trash, floor 42. He folded it in half and placed it on top of the bag. Gerald looked at the bag, looked at Daniel. Found it on the 42nd, Daniel said. Looked like it belonged to someone. Gerald reached for the desk phone without removing his eyes from the bag. He was already dialing as Daniel turned toward the service entrance. Daniel did not wait to hear the conversation. He pushed through the door and out into the cold, and the door closed behind him, and the morning was dark and quiet and very cold. He walked to the bus stop and took the first bus north. He had a shift at 7. He had 4 hours. He used 2 of them sitting in a diner on Wacker, with a coffee that he refilled twice, looking at the traffic beginning to build outside the window, thinking about nothing in particular with somewhat more success than the previous night. Victoria Kane arrived at North Bridge at 7:15, which was 45 minutes later than her standard arrival, a variation that her assistant Philip Hartley noted without commenting on, because Philip had worked for her for 2 years and understood the signal value of a late arrival in a way that made commentary unnecessary. She was 29 years old and had been CEO of Northbridge for 14 months. She had taken the position following the departure of her predecessor, a man named Gerard Sauls, who had left under pressure from the board and who had, in the process of leaving, done a thorough and largely successful job of obscuring the reasons why. Victoria had spent her first 4 months as CEO reconstructing what Gerard Sauls had obscured, which was a difficult project and one she had undertaken without informing anyone on her senior team, because the reconstruction pointed toward the board itself. She wore a red blazer over a white shirt and carried a coffee she had not yet opened. Her assistant met her at the elevator with a stack of messages, the top one printed on a half sheet and flagged with a yellow marker. The bag was in a locked conference room on the 38th floor. She went there before going to her office. Building security had followed protocol, logged the discovery, documented the contents estimate without opening the bag, and noted the employee name from the access badge logs. The name was Daniel Hayes. Victoria knew what the bag was. She had known for 3 weeks that it existed. Though she had not known where it had gone, she had assembled, over the preceding months, a detailed picture of a financial arrangement between 4 members of her board, Edward Marsh, Renata Colfax, Thomas Okafor, and Diane Westfield, and a subsidiary entity registered in the Cayman Islands through which a significant contracts decision had been improperly routed 2.5 years ago. The bag was, in the careful reconstruction she had built, a secondary transfer connected to that original arrangement. It had been in her office. She had kept it there, deliberately, as part of a strategy she had developed with the forensic accounting firm she retained in November, when she returned from Zurich in the 3rd week of December to find it gone. Her first response had been careful and cold. Someone knew she had it, and someone had moved it. The question was what they intended to do with it. Now she understood. The bag had been placed in the service alcove, accessible to maintenance staff, close enough to the bins that it might plausibly have been discarded, far enough from the primary security camera angles that its removal would have been difficult to document precisely. If it had disappeared from there, the chain of custody would have become a problem for her, rather than for the people who had moved it. Instead, a janitor had found it and returned it. Left a 4-word note. Walked out of the building at 5:47 in the morning without asking for anything. She called Gerald at the security desk. She asked for the full name on the access badge. She asked what shift the employee worked. She asked whether the employee had taken anything from the bag. And Gerald said he could not confirm the contents at receipt, but that the bag appeared intact. She called Philip and asked him to run a background check. Then she went to her office and worked through the morning's scheduled calls with the same precision she always brought, because the situation required precision, and precision required not allowing urgency to disrupt the structure of ordinary work. Daniel received the message from building security at 4 in the afternoon. The CEO's office had requested his presence when his shift began. He changed into his work clothes in the locker room and rode the elevator to 42. Philip Hartley showed him to a chair outside the corner office, with the hospitality of someone performing a function rather than extending a courtesy. Daniel sat. The chair was uncomfortable in the way of chairs that are not intended for extended waiting. He had been in rooms like this before, antechambers to offices, where decisions were made, and the sensation was familiar, if not comfortable. Victoria opened the door herself. The office was large and deliberately arranged. A desk of dark wood, uncluttered, a laptop, a single folder, a phone. The credenza behind the desk held one photograph, framed in plain silver. A woman who shared enough of Victoria's features to be her mother, standing in front of what looked like a lake in late summer, floor-to-ceiling glass on 2 sides. The city falling away below in the early evening light, the sky beginning its shift from pale gray to a deeper, colder blue. The room told a particular story about the person who occupied it, not wealth. The building itself communicated that without assistance, something more selective. This was the office of someone who had decided that objects were a form of noise, and that clarity required the removal of noise wherever possible. Victoria gestured to the chair across from her desk. Daniel sat. She remained standing for a moment, then sat across from him. "You found a bag on this floor last night," she said. "Yes," Daniel said, "and returned it." "Yes, without taking anything from it." "I opened it," Daniel said. "I needed to see what it was before I decided what to do." She looked at him steadily, and he returned the look without difficulty. "And you decided to return it." "It wasn't mine." A pause that lasted long enough to be intentional. "You know what was in it. Money. Do you know whose?" "No. But I know it wasn't accidentally misplaced." "Why do you say that?" "I worked in finance for 5 years. That bag was put where it was put by someone who thought about where to put it." She absorbed this. Her expression remained level, not cold exactly, but contained in the way of someone who had trained themselves to process information without broadcasting their conclusions before they were ready to share them. "What did you do in finance?" she asked. "Quantitative analysis. Derivatives and structured products, mostly." "Where?" "Merritt and Caulfield." Something shifted barely, at the margins of her expression. "And now you're here." "My son is sick," Daniel said. "The hours work. The insurance is adequate." She looked at him for a moment longer. "I'm going to run a background check," she said. "I know. That doesn't concern you?" "No." She reached for the phone and relayed a brief instruction to Philip. Then she set it down and looked at Daniel again. And there was something in the look that was different from the rest of the conversation, not warmer, but more direct, as though she had shifted from one kind of assessment to another. "You can go," she said. He stood, straightened the chair, and walked to the door. He did not thank her. She had not done anything that warranted his gratitude, and she did not appear to expect it. The call came at 9:17. Daniel was in the service stairwell between the 37th and 38th floors with a mop and a yellow warning sign when his phone buzzed. He stepped onto the landing and answered. The nurse, whose name he did not catch, told him Lucas had experienced an arrhythmic episode in the early evening. Brief, controlled, without immediate danger, but enough to change Dr. Forsyth's assessment of the timeline. They wanted to operate in 36 hours at the latest. The pre-authorization for the insured portion had cleared. The outstanding balance of $114,000 would need to be resolved before the procedure could begin. The hospital's financial counseling office opened at 8 in the morning. Daniel said he understood. He thanked her. He stood on the stairwell landing for a while after she hung up, one hand against the cold painted concrete, looking at nothing. He called 4 people that night between tasks. His brother Garrett in Denver, who had 2 mortgaged properties and twin daughters in middle school, and who said, with genuine distress, that he could maybe put together $12,000 in a week if he moved some things around, but it would take the full week. His former colleague Nadia Brescher, who was one of the 3 people from Merritt and Caulfield who had maintained any contact with him after his departure, and who expressed honest sympathy and told him about a medical fundraising platform she had seen help other people. A college friend named Preston who had married into money and seemed consistently apologetic about it, who said he would talk to his wife and call Daniel back. Preston did not call back. And the Street Michaels financial counseling line, which had a recorded message indicating office hours of Monday through Friday. 8 to 5. He went back to the mop. He visited Lucas at 11. The boy was propped at a slight angle in the bed, attached to the cardiac monitor that Daniel had, over the past 3 weeks, learned to read at a glance. The yellow blanket from home was bunched at his feet. Lucas's color was reasonable. He had been given something for discomfort, and his eyes had the slightly unfocused quality of a child managing medication with imperfect success. "Dad." "Hey, bud." Daniel took the chair beside the bed and reached for his son's hand. Lucas's fingers were warm. The monitor produced its steady sound, a sound Daniel would hear, he suspected, for years in the space just before sleep. The nurse told me it might feel weird in my chest tomorrow. That's normal before the procedure. Like a tight feeling? That's the one. Lucas nodded slowly. His eyes moved to the window, where the lights of the parking structure were visible in a pattern that had no particular logic but which he had been studying since his admission, apparently working on some private interpretation of it. Dad. Yeah. Am I going to be okay? Daniel looked at his son. He had been asked this question once before, 6 weeks ago, and had given a more qualified answer, something about the doctors being very good and the hospital being well equipped, and had watched Lucas absorb the qualification and decide not to find it satisfying. He had been 7 years old and had correctly identified an evasion. Yes, Daniel said. Lucas's hand tightened around his briefly. Then the boy let out a long breath and let his eyes close. And within 2 minutes, he was asleep. Daniel sat with him for another hour. He watched the monitor. He thought about the bag and about the night's conversation in the corner office, and about the phone call to Garrett, and about the medical fundraising platform Nadia had mentioned, which he had looked up briefly on his phone before deciding that the timeline did not accommodate a crowdfunding campaign. He thought about these things in sequence, and then stopped thinking about them because the monitor was steady and Lucas was breathing, and that was the only thing that was true right now without qualification. He drove home in the dark, the heat in his car producing a faint rattling that had been there since October and that he could not currently afford to have looked at. The streets were mostly empty. He took the long route without meaning to, looping through blocks he did not need to travel through, because the motion was something to do while he figured out what to do next. Victoria read the report at 6 in the morning, before the building was fully staffed, with the city still in its gray pre-dawn state outside the window and a second coffee going cold beside her keyboard. Daniel Hayes, 32 years old, undergraduate degree in applied mathematics from the University of Illinois, followed by a master's in financial engineering from Carnegie Mellon. 6 years at Merritt and Caulfield in a quantitative analysis role, most recently at the senior associate level, departed 14 months before the firm's dissolution. The SEC investigation into Merritt and Caulfield's derivatives portfolio had been initiated by an anonymous regulatory tip. The timing of Hayes's departure and the initiation of the investigation formed a pattern that did not require extensive analysis to read. He had not been charged with any violation. He had received no compensation, public recognition, or professional benefit in connection with whatever information had moved. He was currently employed as a night shift maintenance worker. He had a son named Lucas, age 7, with a diagnosed cardiac condition. The insurance coverage through his current employer covered the majority of the surgical cost. The outstanding balance was documented in the credit report as a pending medical liability of $114,000. Victoria set the printed report on the desk and opened the folder she had been building since November. She laid the report beside the folder's contents and looked at both. The board members Edward Marsh, who chaired the audit committee, Renata Colfax and Thomas Okafor, who were the two most active voices in the contract's approval process, and Diane Westfield, who had been unusually quiet on the relevant decisions and whose silence, Victoria had come to understand, was a form of active consent, had moved approximately $4 million through the Cayman structure over an 18-month period. The bag in the service alcove represented roughly half of a secondary transfer, one that had been routed outside the primary structure, possibly because the primary structure was already under scrutiny from the forensic accountants. The bag had been moved from her office to the alcove during her absence. She now had a specific theory about who had done this and why. And the theory was consistent with the timeline of Marsh's building access logs, which she had quietly obtained through the facilities management system 3 days ago. If Daniel Hayes had taken the money, and he had had both the opportunity and, given his son's situation, a reason that most reasonable people would have found sympathetic, if not entirely justifiable, the chain of custody would have been broken. The money would have been gone, untraceable in the short term, and the question of where it had gone would have become a tool in the hands of people who were practiced at using tools. He had not taken it. He had returned it with a 4-word note. He had done this while his son needed surgery that he could not pay for. Victoria closed both folders. She picked up her phone and called the firm's general counsel, A deliberate and thorough man named Richard Stamos, who had been waiting, she suspected, for a call like this one for some time. "I need you to come in this morning," she said. "We need to start the formal documentation process on Marsh and the others. I have everything we need." She paused. "Also, get me the contact for Street Michael's Medical Center. Billing or financial services, whoever handles large prepayment arrangements." Victoria came at 7 in the evening. She had called first a brief call in which she said she would like to speak with him at the hospital if that was acceptable. And Daniel had said it was, and neither of them elaborated on why. He was in the corridor outside Lucas's room, in the plastic chair he had occupied many times over the past weeks. The chair was the particular shade of gray that hospital furniture reaches after years of use. He was looking at something on his phone, a news article about a bridge construction project he had no connection to without actually reading it. He heard her before he saw her. The footsteps were different from the medical staff's, a different rhythm, a different weight distribution, the sound of someone walking at her own pace through a space rather than moving efficiently between tasks. He looked up. Victoria Kane was in a dark coat over a gray sweater. No red blazer. The difference was noticeable in a way that was difficult to specify. She was more present, somehow, or perhaps just more visible, without the particular armor of professional dress. Daniel stood. She told him not to. He stood anyway. Because his father had been the kind of man who stood when someone entered a room, and some habits ran deeper than deliberate reconsideration. "How is he?" she asked. "Sleeping." He nodded toward the glass. The yellow blanket was visible. "Surgery is tomorrow morning." 7 o'clock. "Dr. Forsyth?" "Yes." Victoria looked at the glass for a moment. "She's excellent," Victoria said. "I checked her record when I got the hospital's contact." Daniel looked at her. "You called the hospital already. I wanted to understand the situation before I came." He said nothing to this. It was a reasonable thing to do, and he recognized it as such. "I know what you did," she said. The corridor was quiet. 2 nurses passed at the far end, talking quietly. "I know what you did last night. And I know what you did at Merritt and Caulfield. And I know what both of those things cost you." Daniel was quiet for a moment. "The bag," he said. "Not a question exactly. It's evidence in something I've been working to document for 3 months. If it had disappeared from that alcove, or if there had been any ambiguity about where it went, I would have lost the thread. The people responsible would have had a story they could use. But it didn't disappear. No." He leaned against the wall beside the chair, his arms crossed loosely, not defensive, just a posture. The corridor smelled of antiseptic and something that might have been institutional coffee from the nurse's station down the hall. "I'm not looking for anything," Daniel said. "I know. That's why I'm here." She paused. "I'm offering to cover the surgery. The full, outstanding balance. I've already been in contact with the billing office. They can process a guarantee letter tonight if I authorize it." He looked at her. "Why?" "Because you made something possible that needed to happen. And because your son is 7 years old and shouldn't wait for surgery because of a number that you can't reach." "Those are different reasons," Daniel said. "Yes. Both are true." He was quiet for a long moment. Through the glass, Lucas shifted in his sleep, pulling the yellow blanket up without waking. "He doesn't need to know about the other part," Daniel said. "About the bag? About any of it. He just needs to know the surgery is happening, and that he's going to be okay." "That's all I'd tell him," Victoria said. He nodded once, a small motion. Then yes. "Thank you." They stood in the corridor for a while after that. Neither of them spoke. There were things in the air between them. Questions she had not asked. Context he had not offered, but there was no urgency to any of it. And they both seemed to recognize this. The immediate thing was handled. The rest could wait. She left at 8. He stayed. He sat in the corridor chair with the plastic armrests and the gray upholstery until the night nurse came by on her 10 o'clock round and suggested, with practiced gentleness, that he might want to get some sleep before tomorrow. He said he would. He did not immediately. He sat a while longer, looking at the glass and the yellow blanket and the steady line of the cardiac monitor, and then he stood, stretched, and drove home through the dark. The surgery was scheduled for 7. Daniel arrived at 5:30 because he could not sleep after 4:15 and saw no reason to perform the attempt. He had made coffee in the apartment, drunk half of it standing at the counter in the dark, checked on Lucas, who was still sleeping, the monitor steady, and then driven to the hospital through streets that were nearly empty, the city in that particular in-between state that exists just before the early shifts begin. He spoke with a pre-op nurse named Carmen, who had the particular efficiency of someone who had done this work for a long time and had learned that efficiency was itself a form of kindness. Get the information exchanged, get the process moving, reduce the duration of the waiting. He liked her for this. He told her so, which surprised her, and she smiled the small smile of someone unaccustomed to being thanked for a functional skill. Dr. Forsyth came at 6:50. She spent 4 minutes explaining the procedure in the precise, calibrated way Daniel had come to associate with her, detailed enough to convey competence, structured enough to reduce the surface area for anxiety. He had questions, and she answered them. She had, he thought, done this many times and had arrived at a version of this conversation that was honest without being cruel. He watched the doors close at 7:04. The family waiting area on the 4th floor had chairs upholstered in a green that was probably specified in some design document as calming, and which had arrived at a kind of institutional neutrality after years of use. There was a coffee station in the corner, a television mounted at an angle that served no viewing position particularly well, and a window looking out over the hospital's west parking structure. Daniel took a chair near the window and poured a coffee and sat. He called his brother Garrett at 7:20. Garrett answered immediately, which meant he had been awake, which meant he had been worrying, which was the kind of thing Daniel noticed about his brother but did not comment on. "It started," Daniel said. "The balance is covered. You don't have to move anything around." A pause. "How?" "A work situation worked out." Another pause. "Daniel, he's going to be fine, Garrett. Call you when it's done." He hung up and sat with the coffee. He thought about Nadia Brescher and the medical fundraising platform, and about Preston who had not called back, and about his brother's voice, with the particular quality of a man who wanted to do more than he could. He thought about these things without resentment. The people in his life were what they were, which was mostly people trying to manage their own circumstances, while being occasionally and imperfectly available to the circumstances of others. This was, in his assessment, the normal condition of being alive. He thought about the alcove on the 42nd floor, the weight of the bag in both hands, the city behind the glass at midnight, doing nothing in particular about anything. He had, in his former professional life, been trained to model outcomes, to assign probabilities to scenarios, and to weight decisions by expected value across a range of possible futures. He had not done any of that on the night of January 14th. He had done something simpler and harder to formalize. He had read what he was, the way an engineer reads a structural condition, and found that the load he was being asked to carry was outside the specifications of what he was willing to be. He did not think of this as virtue. He thought of it as a measurement. At 11:40, a nurse came to tell him they were in the final stage of closure. Everything consistent with expectations. Daniel thanked her, poured his cold coffee into the sink, and poured a fresh cup. He sat back down. He looked at the parking structure. He thought about nothing in particular with complete success for the first time in several months. Dr. Forsyth came through the doors at 1:14. She was still in her surgical cap. She walked directly to him, and this was the detail that told him everything. The direct line across the room, the eye contact held from 15 feet away, and when she reached him, she said, "The surgery was successful. He's in recovery. He'll be groggy for several hours. You can see him in about 45 minutes. Daniel said thank you. He said it twice, which was once more than he usually said things. She nodded and went back through the doors. He sat in the green chair and looked at the parking structure. The sun had moved since the morning, and the angle of the light had changed, the shadows longer and more precise. He sat there for a long time, not doing anything in particular, which was what a person does when the weight they have been carrying for a long time is suddenly, precisely, set down. Lucas surfaced from the anesthesia in stages. The first time he opened his eyes, he looked at Daniel and then closed them again without speaking. The second time, he looked at Daniel and kept his eyes open. "Dad, here." Lucas took inventory of his situation: the bed, the IV line taped to his left arm, the monitor, the window where the afternoon light was doing something geometrically interesting with the blinds. He moved his right hand and found Daniel's arm and held it. "Did they fix it?" "Yes." He processed this. "My chest feels weird. That's normal. It'll get better. Probably a week before it feels like nothing. A week. Maybe 10 days. That's a long time. You've had a long week already." Lucas considered this as though it were a mathematical proposition. "True," he said. He looked at the window again. "Will you be here when I wake up again?" "Yes." He was asleep within 3 minutes. Daniel stayed in the chair beside him and watched the monitor, and let himself, for the first time in some weeks, sit in a room without planning anything. The discharge paperwork was processed at 10 in the morning. Carmen, the pre-op nurse, Arsha's not on that ward, but the discharge nurse was efficient in a similar way, which Daniel appreciated. Lucas sat on the edge of the bed while Daniel signed the forms, swinging his feet in the manner of someone who has been confined and is reclaiming the small motion of swinging his feet as an early installment on larger freedoms. He had made a list. It had been revised several times over the previous 4 days, as his energy returned and his ambitions expanded. The current version included watching a documentary series about deep-sea fish, eating cereal for dinner at least twice, resuming a drawing project he described as complicated, and going to the park when it was warm enough, which Daniel pointed out might require waiting for March. Lucas had accepted this amendment. They went out through the main lobby. Daniel had brought the wheelchair because the discharge protocol required it, and Lucas was tolerating the wheelchair with the particular diplomacy of a child who understands that some rules are not worth contesting. He sat in it, with the yellow blanket folded on his lap. The sliding doors opened onto the cold 26 degrees, which after the past several weeks registered as something approaching reasonable. The sky was a pale, clean blue without cloud, and the sun was low and cast shadows that were long and sharp-edged across the concrete. Victoria Kane was standing at the curb beside a dark sedan. She was in the red blazer again, over a heavier coat this time, her breath visible in the cold air. She had sent a message the previous day saying she would be there, and Daniel had said that was fine. She looked at Lucas. Lucas looked back at her with the frank and unhurried assessment that 7-year-olds apply to unfamiliar adults before deciding how to categorize them. "This is someone from my building," Daniel said. "Your work building?" "Yes." "You work at night," Lucas said. "The people in your building are mostly gone when you're there." Victoria's expression shifted, not quite a smile, but the near neighbor of one. The face a person makes when something lands unexpectedly and precisely. "We overlap sometimes," Daniel said. Lucas appeared to find this acceptable. He looked at Victoria with somewhat less suspicion. "Is she your boss?" Daniel looked at Victoria. Victoria looked at Daniel. There was a beat in which neither of them supplied the obvious answer. "Something like that," Daniel said. Lucas nodded, satisfied with this, and turned his attention to the parking lot, where a pigeon was doing something complicated near a concrete pillar. Daniel pushed the wheelchair toward the car. Victoria walked alongside. At a distance that was respectful of the particular shape of the moment, close enough to be present, far enough not to crowd it. The sun was behind them, coming in flat and bright across the pavement, and their shadows went ahead of them, in the way shadows do in the late morning of a clear winter day. Some things do not resolve so much as they settle. The board matter would take months. Stamos had told her as much, and she had planned accordingly, building the documentation layer by layer, taking the time to build it correctly rather than quickly. Marsh and the others had retained counsel of their own, which told her the case was strong enough to warrant it. She had expected this and was not troubled by it. Daniel would return to his shift on Monday. He had not decided yet what he wanted the following year to look like. And he did not feel the need to decide immediately. He had a son who was going home and a follow-up appointment with Dr. Forsyth in 3 weeks, and a list in his pocket that included deep-sea fish and cereal for dinner. These were the nearest items on the horizon. Lucas looked up from the pigeon situation. Can we stop at the place with the good sandwiches on the way home? It's 11 in the morning. So yes? Daniel looked down at his son, who was looking up at him with the expression of someone who knows they are probably winning an argument they have not quite made yet. So yes, Daniel said. The car was at the curb. The sky was blue and definite. The boy was going home. That was enough for one day. And also, Daniel suspected, the beginning of something, though he did not try to name it yet, because naming things too early was its own kind of error, and he had learned, over the past year, to let certain things become what they were going to become without interference. He loaded the wheelchair into the trunk. He helped Lucas into the back seat. He closed the door. Victoria stood at the driver's side of the sedan. I'll be in touch, she said, about the other matter. When there's something definite to report, I'd appreciate that, Daniel said. She nodded. He got into the car. The engine started. The boy was already watching the parking lot with the full attention of someone who has just been given back the ordinary world and intends to pay it close notice. The car pulled away from the curb and onto the street, and the hospital receded in the side mirror until it was just another large building among large buildings, indistinguishable from the rest. Lucas pressed his forehead to the window and watched the city go by. He asked the names of 2 buildings. He commented on the color of a transit bus. He fell asleep before they reached the sandwich place, in the boneless and complete way that recovering children sleep, and Daniel did not stop, just drove home through the pale January afternoon with the heat running, and the radio off, and his son sleeping in the back seat under the yellow blanket he had carried in from the hospital without being asked. He thought about nothing in particular. He was, he found, quite good at it now. It had taken most of a year to learn. But he had learned it, and he suspected it was one of the more useful things he had acquired in recent memory, this capacity to be simply in a moving car, in winter light, with his son sleeping behind him, and the road ahead doing what roads do, which is continue.